ASCC in short, or we refer to as Masjid Nuh. It's the first mosque that's been established here in the borough of Spelthorne. It's been 7 years since we acquired this property, and it's something that we're very proud of in terms of what we've achieved here over the years. I was born here in Ashford, as I've mentioned to some of my friends here, and we never had a place to worship, to come and pray. We'd always have to travel at least 10 miles, 15 miles into Hounslow, Southall, just for our Friday prayers. But then when our local congregation came here, some local professionals, we decided to take some action, and we came together to found this place over 7 years ago. Our vision is really to establish a vibrant centre, and since we've been here for the last 7 years, we've offered a number of holistic, if you like, activities, religious, spiritual, educational, social and charitable services for the Muslim and for the wider communities of Ashford and Staines, and we draw upon our Islamic heritage and values. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The best of you are those who bring most benefit to people." And it's really within that spirit that this centre, this mosque, was founded. I could go on about Noah's Ark, but really I want to spend more time on the discussion today. But before that, I just want to thank a few people. This evening actually spawned out of some discussions that we had with different faith groups, different community members that came together under the initiation of our beloved sister Kawthar Akhtar, who came from Surrey Faith Links to help us establish a faith forum. There isn't a faith forum here in the borough of Spelthorne, so we're working on that right now as we speak. So really I want to thank Sister Kawthar for all her help in what she's done. We've got some really notable people here. I'm not sure if Nigel's arrived in, Nigel Drury from Spelthorne. We also have Reverend Chris Swift here as well, which we thank, and his colleague Pamela. We just want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope we all benefit from what's being discussed. The topic for today is spiritual crises, reconnecting with God. And for many, it can be a bit of a boring topic. And it's really funny, I was just talking to my younger brother. He loves professional wrestling. I don't know if anybody else loves the wrestling here, WWF. And in a way of coaxing him over here, I said, "Guess who's coming to the mosque? Mr. Perfect." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, Mr. Perfect's going to be here." And then I showed him the poster, and Mr. Perfect is here indeed. Simon Perfect is with us today. But so spiritual crisis. Einstein said, "Crisis is the greatest blessing for people and nations because crisis brings on progress. He who blames his own failures and difficulties to crisis rapes his own talent and gives more importance to problems than to solutions." Our honourable speakers today will be addressing this concept of the spiritual crisis as is defined by their faith perspective, Christianity and Islam. What are their symptoms, and perhaps what are the solutions that our faiths, our beloved faiths, offer us. So without further ado, I'd like to just call upon the first speaker today, who is Simon Perfect. Simon, in 2014, joined Theos, a Christian think tank which is committed to the belief that religion in general and Christianity in particular has much to offer for the common good. Theos was launched in 2006 with the support of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, but remains independent of any particular denomination. Simon is a freelance researcher and a teaching fellow at SOAS University, where he leads campus-based and distance learning courses exploring Muslim communities in Britain and in other minority settings. Simon's read history at the University of Cambridge and has a master's in the study of religions from SOAS. So without further ado, if I can ask Simon to come and address us, please.
Well, good evening, everybody, and hopefully this is all set up and working. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you tonight, and thank you very much for the warm introduction. I am Mr. Perfect. It doesn't get any better than this, I'm afraid. I'm a researcher at Theos, and we are, as has been said, we are a Christian-based think tank, and I'm also a teaching fellow at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. So I'm a Christian, but I'm also a kind of sociologist of religion, really. And I thought tonight I'd start off with that kind of sociological hat on to give a sort of sense of where we are in this country in terms of religion, where we are in terms of secularism and secularization, because those are big kind of questions that feed into this particular question we're having tonight about spiritual crisis. What is a spiritual crisis? There's lots of talks, lots of discussion quite often about what are we in the UK today? Are we a Christian country? Are we a plural country, a multi-faith country? Are we a secular country? Are we a secularizing country? And I think the best way to describe what we are today is that we are simultaneously a Christian country, a multi-faith country, and a secular country. It simply depends upon which level you kind of look at to answer that question. We're still a Christian country, of course, because Christianity retains huge influence in our national and educational life, in the charity sector, and in our laws and our historical sense of self. And of course, about half of the population still describe themselves as Christian. We are, of course, a multi-faith country. We're increasingly plural. We know, for example, that Islam is the fastest growing religion in this country, and about 5% of the population would describe themselves as Muslim here. And we know that religion is being increasingly talked about in the public sphere. We could say that religion is increasingly visible in our public sphere. Some of you may remember a few years ago that Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's spin doctor, said, "We don't do God. We don't talk about God in politics." Well, I think things have changed in the last few years since that position of we don't talk about God in politics and in the media. You are seeing journalists talking about religion now. You are seeing some politicians talking about how they value faith, and they're even sometimes talking about their own faith as well. So religion is becoming increasingly visible in the public sphere. Now, a lot of that, of course, has to do with concerns around religious violence and extremism, but it's also due to what's happened in the last 10 years in terms of faith-based social action, faith-based groups stepping up to the plate in an era of austerity, where the state stops providing the kind of key social services, and it's actually been the faith groups that are stepping up and are filling that gap. We know, for example, since 2006, more faith-based charities have been founded than non-faith-based charities. So what that kind of means is that religious people in this country are disproportionately doing more to help their neighbours. So, yes, we are still a Christian country, and we are a multi-faith society, and religion is becoming increasingly visible in the public sphere. But we are also a secular country, and we are a secularizing country. Secularization is ongoing. If we think about Christianity, for example, my faith, we know that in 1983, 40% of the population would have described themselves as Anglicans, part of the Church of England. In 2017, we know that went down to 14%. So over the space of a couple of decades, that's a huge drop in the number of people describing themselves as part of the Church of England. More than half of people today describe themselves as having no religion, and among those who are 18 to 24-year-olds, 70% of people say they have no religion. So we can see in the last few decades how rapid that change has been. Now, how people identify what they sort of describe themselves as is not the whole story, of course. We also need to look at what people actually do, their practices, and also what people believe. But we also know, again, in terms of Christianity, church attendance is really low, is continuously declining. And more widely, we know that conventional religious beliefs, basic religious beliefs, are also declining. If you take any kind of standard poll, about a third of people in this country would say they believe in God. So 2/3 of people, on average, would say they don't believe in God now. We combine that as well with extremely poor religious literacy, understanding of basic knowledge about religion. As an example, in December 2015, 1,000 school children were asked, what do they know about Christmas? 52% thought Christmas Day was the birth of Santa Claus, 20% thought Jesus was a footballer, and 35% thought he was born at the South Pole. Which is crazy, really. So what that shows is we've not only got a spiritual crisis in terms of passing on faith to the next generation, but there's also a crisis of basic knowledge as well, a basic knowledge about religion. I suppose what we can draw from that is that when people are turning away from faith these days, quite often it's not because that they have come to a conclusion based upon a lot of in-depth thinking about it. They haven't determined that faith is immoral or it's incompatible with science, for example. Quite often, they simply haven't been exposed to religion or faith at all. They haven't had that basic exposure. And for religious people, that can pose both an opportunity, but also a real problem, because how do you talk to non-religious people who have none of the same language or basic concepts that we might have? How do you talk to somebody about God if that concept of God is not something that somebody has been raised in, someone is used to? It is important to note, though, that this picture of doom and gloom, for Christianity in particular, is not the whole story. We know that in some areas of the country, religion and Christianity are growing, in London in particular, and part of that is due to immigration from Europe. And we also know that just because somebody says that they don't have a religion, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have beliefs that we might call spiritual. Lots of people would describe themselves as being spiritual but not religious. And a lot of those people who might say, I don't have a religion, they may not be atheists. They may still believe in God. There's a proportion of people who describe themselves as not being religious who are not atheists. So we can sort of take from that there's been a shift in the default position over the last few decades. Previously, the default position would be to say that you were a Christian or you were an Anglican. Now, the automatic default position is to say you have no religion. Even though you might still retain some spiritual beliefs. So there's a turning away from organised religion, but it's not necessarily to atheism. Quite often it's to more personalised, less committed, often more consumer-based forms of religion and religious practice. And on a global level, of course, we know that religion is growing. We know that 85% and counting of the world's population say that they have a religion. Taken all together then, I think that we can say in the UK there's a kind of strange paradox about religion in that religion is becoming more visible in the public sphere. We're talking about it more. But at the same time, it's undeniable that secularisation is ongoing and people are falling away from faith. So thinking about the future of Christianity then, in particular in this country, what does that look like? You would think that if Christian numbers are declining, that would mean that Christian activity is also declining. But actually we kind of see the opposite. We see that the future of Christianity in this country looks like fewer people doing more in terms of social action. So the numbers are declining, but Christians are getting more and more involved in social action, helping their neighbours, helping their communities. We know, for example, that over 80% of Church of England churches are involved in some kind of social action project. Churches are involved in almost 33,000 social action projects, including running 13,000 projects themselves. That could be debt counselling services, homelessness services, community cafes for the elderly and the lonely, parent and toddler groups, breakfast clubs. We know that in the church, the biggest area of social action is in food banks. About half of food banks in this country half of churches in this country are involved in running a food bank in some way. Often this kind of work is done in partnership with other faiths, and it's through those kind of social action projects that barriers are being broken down and new friendships are being born across communities, hopefully, as in new friendships that might be born from something like this tonight. So in terms of numbers about how many people are affected by that kind of social action, we've worked out at Theos that about 10 million adults in England have used church services in the last 12 months, which doesn't include going to a religious service or a wedding or a funeral. They're using the kinds of social action services that churches are providing. So even though religious belief and practice is declining, we know that people in this country are still depending upon the kind of services that churches and other faith groups are providing. At Theos, the think tank where I work, we're doing a big project at the moment with the Church of England to look at the kind of relationship between social action and church growth. We're sending our research around the country to speak to different churches about this. And one thing she noticed is that when local services get pulled back in a particular area, when the council funding gets cut, it's the churches and the mosques and the synagogues and other faith groups that are still there, and they step up into the breach to provide those services. That's the case, for example, in St. Peter's Church in Blackpool, which is statistically the number one most deprived parish in the Church of England in the country. And the vicar there at St. Peter's has been there for 6 years. In that time, in those 6 years, the council has changed hands a number of times. Secular charities have all lost their funding. The doctor's surgery has moved away. So the vicar now in that church is the longest standing community stakeholder. She's the one who knows the area. She knows the people. She knows the local needs. She's the steady pillar in that community that is seriously deprived. So despite there being less Christians around, and there will probably continue to be a declining number of Christians around in this country in the next few decades, they are doing more in their communities, and we can expect that to continue. And crucially, they're not just doing more just to help their neighbours, they're often doing it explicitly and vocally because of their faith. They're doing it for the community and for God. We call this at Theos, we've termed this social liturgy, liturgy being an ancient Greek word meaning kind of a selfless service that's done both for humans and for God, social liturgy. And that's where the strength of this kind of social action work lies. It's a dual kind of love. It's love that's both of your neighbour and of your community and love of God. So that's where I think we are. There are undeniable huge challenges for people of faith living in a secular society, and a society that is becoming increasingly secular. The Church of England in particular is facing a huge demographic crisis, and it remains to be seen really whether that can be pulled back in the next few decades. But it isn't all doom and gloom. We can celebrate in particular the work that faith groups are doing in this social action work. They're getting out there and they are helping their neighbour. And at this time of intense polarisation in our country, a final thing to say would be that faith groups have got a key role here in trying to bring about some reconciliation. We need that reconciliation now, since we're in such a polarised country. And it's the faith groups that are in a key place to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was very enlightening, and I was getting a bit depressed halfway through until the end, and I'm very glad that it's not all doom and gloom. I think the challenges that both the Christian faith and the Muslim faith face are very, very similar. Before we move on to our next speaker, I'd like to treat our guests to what Islam refers to as the Kalam of Allah. Kalam Allah, the Word of God. And for us, it's a really spiritual experience, just hearing the words of God. And it just gives me pleasure when I see young people here. My children are running around, and the young children that I teach here in the martial arts classes that we hold, also flourishing as they come through, facing the challenges of this world and still holding on to faith. So I'd like to call upon Zainab Bilal just to recite some small verses from the Quran. Zainab?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلى نار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Zainab. She's also very good at jiu-jitsu, by the way. She can take any of you boys down. So I call upon our next speaker, Suleyman van Eyl. Suleyman converted to Islam when he was 18 years old. He then headed out to Sudan to memorize the Quran. He studied in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Morocco, Belgium, and Holland with more than 50 different mashayikh. Mashayikh are scholars of religion. He was a professor at the Rotterdam University and was appointed as the head of teachers by the Muslim executive. He has a bachelor in theology, a master's in mental health, and is a counsellor at the London School of Economics, Imperial University, and is a chaplain also at the SOAS University. He's also he was voted, named one of the most 500 most influential Muslims, I believe by the Royal Jordanian Institute of Thought, Islamic Thought. And it's a publication that has over 500 Muslims that are mentioned in there from around the world, and he's one of them. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon our beloved Sheikh Van Eyl, Suleyman Van Eyl, to come and address us.
I don't know why I always have the impression that I see better with my glasses off. I don't know why. Always when I read a book or I have to talk, I take them off. So anyway. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. To start with, all these beautiful titles don't turn a person into anybody. It's who he is and what he does as a human being, and not what he achieved in the academical world or wherever. We will go to God and we will return to Him exactly as He knows who we are when we are alone, and how He knows who we are on the inside. As I can be very generous giving money, but on the inside I might feel the pain, so I'm not generous at all then. So to come back, I want to wish you all a warm welcome, and I'm really, and I'm not saying this to flatter, I'm honored to stand in front of you, to be of service within this beautiful project that I believe is one of the milestones, inshallah, and one of the things that we all need to do to come together, build these bridges and go against all this polarization and all these things going on, and to reach out the hands and really go forward in a positive vibe. I would also like to thank Kawthar Akhtar, who is behind all this, who is steering this, who is leading this, and who got us together, people of different faiths. So thank you so much, barakallahu feekum. And I know that people who do things for God do not want to be thanked. I also want to thank our brother and all the other people of Ashford and Staines, always putting their shoulders under these kinds of projects. And Mr. Perfect, your talk was perfect. But you must have heard this joke most likely, but I really mean it. So now what I'm going to do, the approach of Mr. Perfect was very an academical approach. I'm more a Bedouin. I just came back from the desert, and I'm trying to talk at my own simple level in a way that I think can be beneficial for myself, because I'm more in need than anybody else of this, and then for the rest of us. So we are talking about a spiritual crisis. What do we mean when we say this? When I look around and I listen to Muslims in particular, because my Christian brothers and sisters don't usually come to me as an imam talking about their spiritual crisis, like, hey imam, I've got a problem. But I believe that we as believers, we very often experience a spiritual crisis. What do I mean myself when I say spiritual crisis? It is looking at the text and comparing it to yourself. Looking at all these beautiful attributes that are mentioned in the Bible, in the Quran, in the Torah, and then you look at yourself and you say like, I'm not reflecting this. I am not that generosity. I am not that patience. I am not this endurance. I am not this love giver. I am not. So at a certain point when we look at ourselves and this is kind of introspection, then we are going to see that we are living. And of course, I'm not trying to say anybody amongst you. When I say we, it might be that some amongst us are these holy people that are raised far above what I am talking about. And if they are, then I would like to become like them. But the majority of the believers, they feel this. They say, I believe, but I don't always feel what I believe. I believe that God is the provider, but when all of a sudden I'm in financial difficulty, all of a sudden I lose my trust. I know that God gives and takes, but sometimes when He takes what I love, all of a sudden I consider Him to be taking away something I liked, and I question why. This doesn't turn me into a disbeliever, but it is someone whose belief is shaken. And if we don't understand that we will find God behind being submissive to God in everything He does in our lives, then we most probably won't find God. He wants us, and I'm talking from a Muslim perspective, He wants us to be pleased with Him in everything He does, and that we live up to everything He wants. So the spiritual crisis, as Timothy Keller described in his book about prayer, starts very often within prayer. Timothy Keller, one of the Christian preachers as well, and I don't know if he's a minister or he is, okay, I'm very sorry. So in his book, he talks about the feeling of the absence of God within prayer. So we Muslims, we say that How can you know that you are experiencing a crisis within your religion? They say, look at your prayer and look at the quality within your prayer. This is where you will be able to weigh yourself. When you look at your prayer, because that is the place where you are supposed to find God. When you stand in front of someone you love, in someone you are in awe for, you will forget about everything else. Once I asked one of my teachers, is it possible for me to forget my pain? He said, if you now were to hurt your finger, and then all of a sudden you would, may God protect our children, I mean, and if you were to see a car riding over your child, would you remember the pain in your finger? You wouldn't. And if we have this strong belief in God, then whatever is happening in life, in our personal life or around us, when we are connected with God, pain disappears. So now the spiritual crisis is the one of wanting to get connected to the divine, but that you feel that the connection seems to be going in one way. Very often it's going on in the mind, not in the heart. We believe with our mind, but now we want to believe with our souls, where what you believe in becomes a part of yourself, where it becomes your vision, your life. It is that which you breathe, that what you long for. And that is how. But now, what is very important to know is when you experience, when you admit that there is something wrong, you're actually not living a spiritual crisis. You are someone who wants to be found by God. Because if He doesn't want you to find Him, He wouldn't have given you the feeling that you are looking for Him. If you are looking for Him, it's because He wants to be found. So you acknowledging and knowing and experiencing that there is something wrong is actually God reviving your heart. This actually means that you are a believer, not that you are a doubter. So I want to mention that someone came to the Messenger of God, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, "Oh Messenger of God, sometimes I have these thoughts about God, and I can't get rid of them, but I dislike them, I despise them, I hate them, and it's more beloved to me to die than to utter them." He said, "Did you experience this? Did you find this?" He said, "Yes." He said, "This is the beginning of faith. It is when you hear a little voice, you say, oh, this is not correct. I'm not supposed to think like this." How many people go through life, they never give their thoughts a second thought. They think this is my world, my thought, my brain. But when your faith is strong, you will hear the thoughts that are yours or the thoughts that are inspired by somebody whose name we know. So where did this come from? So now, why do we sometimes feel weaker than we really are? When we Muslims, we have these, like Timothy Keller calls them, prayer warriors. We have these prayer warriors like Uwais al-Qarni, for example. We have others like Abu Hanifa. We have these prayer warriors. Well, the Christians also have these prayer warriors. When I look at the Still Hour, for example, of Austin Phelps, for example, he talks about people like Payson and Cowper and others, where he says that they said, if you were to experience what we experience in prayer, you would die out of joy. And if it weren't God empowering us with the power to connect to Him, we would have died. How can we connect to the eternal, the everlasting, if it were not for His grace and His mercy? So now, when we compare ourselves to these people who would forget their own name during prayer, and then we look at ourselves. When I pray, I say Allahu Akbar, the first thing I might be thinking about is my rent, is about my next appointment. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes it's a bit more intense, sometimes it's not at all. I say Allahu Akbar, there I am saying something with my mouth, but I'm not saying it with my heart. So there is something going on. So then I compare myself to these people, like Uwais al-Qarni, like Payson and so forth. I compare myself. But what we forget is that the way their prayer was described, it was the result of decades of devotion and decades of intense submissiveness within prayer, fighting their own souls, fighting their sins, to at the end find God behind this struggle. So yes, when we look at them and we compare ourselves, I'm weak. But everybody went through difficult periods and eventually became that saint, that beautiful Pole person whom we look up to. So this would be one thing. This would be one of the reasons why we feel weak. We compare ourselves to the greatest of the great, amongst the great. The second thing, social media. I'm not saying social media is forbidden or haram, is it? The ruling of social media is exactly what it is used for. If it is for something bad, then it's bad. If it's for something good, it's good. But there are two things we need on our path to God which social media destroys. The first thing, social media makes us self-centered, while our connection to God is God-centered. It's all about God. It's all about the Creator. It's about our connection to Him. It's not about me. It's about Him. And social media, here we are. Even when we look at Matthew 6:5, we see it was not like the social media of today, but look, and when you pray, then don't pray like the hypocrites pray. They pray in synagogues and in the corners of the street because they want to be seen by men. This would be the what? The prayer of a hypocrite. So in Matthew here, 6:5, it says that the hypocrites, they want to be seen. They want to show their good deeds. And this is what social media now is turning us into. People who want to be observed and seen. But we want to see God. And sometimes I'm afraid that God will ask me, why are you inviting towards yourself while everybody was forgetting about me? Were you so important that people knew your name and forgot about mine? So this is the first thing, social media, what social media does. And secondly, your road to God is in need of patience, devotion, steadfastness. And social media doesn't do this. When my computer doesn't answer or doesn't, take me to the next site in the next 3 seconds, I become angry. So now we think the way we go about with God is exactly the same. I asked you, you didn't give me. I wanted from you, you grant me. So this is the second thing which social media is teaching us. So, in brief, how can we now connect to God? Well, it's actually very easy. Apart from staying away from bad things, it is having a sincere intention behind everything you do, so that everything in your life is transformed into a form of worship. Being it changing the diaper of your child to remove it from its burden, being taking out the how do you call that? Yes, the trash. How did you know? Because I went like this. I carry trash like that, by the way. So, or be it merely by, taking out the trash or opening a door or smiling or whatever. Being good to your wife, to your husband, to your children, to your neighbor, to have this intention, even when you eat well, which I don't do, by the way, but even if you were to eat well and take care of your body, you're taking care of that which God has given to you. So if you now are able to transform everything in your life into a form of worship and dedication to God Almighty, subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you will find God behind everything you do. And then when you get into prayer, you have actually created the perfect environment before your prayer. And then you get into your prayer and there you are. This is the climax of your existence, is to connect to God. But how are you going to connect? Sinning, God, here I am. Well, the effect of sin on the human heart and the human soul is disastrous. You first need to go through these layers and layers and layers. But if you now come to prayer like a person who stayed away from sinning, try to please God at all times, it's like switching on the light. Here I am. Light was already on. I was there waiting for you. No need for you to turn on the light. You are the light. Getting connected to the light. So in very brief, if we want to get rid of this spiritual crisis, which I believe that I am living, and a lot of my fellow believers, then we need to turn our lives into a form of worship every single minute, looking for God's face and being grateful for everything He gave us, and to stay away from sinning. And then, inshallah, God willing, we will find what we were looking for. And as I said at the very beginning, if you are looking for Him, the only reason is because He wants to be found by you. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Thank you so much.
wireless one. I
I
think.
take off my glasses, I take away the mic. There we go.
So, thank you very much to both Simon and to Suleyman for these wonderful discussions, talks. I'd like to open it up now for questions. We've got it till, I'd say 7:20 before I'm going to ask you all to grab a seat and take it into the back because the food will be served. Before that, I'd like just to open up the floor for any questions for our speakers who are here today. Any questions? Nothing at all. Maybe I've got a question for Simon. Simon, just a question around, you mentioned social action and growing the church. In your opinion, in your studies, in your research, have you found that there is a propensity for people, particularly youth, to want to do social things, and they're activists and they want to do things that are positively changing the world, but then struggle with squaring that off with their faith because perhaps the church is not outwardly doing that, although they are certainly embedded in the values of Christianity, and we all know love thy neighbour, but perhaps people don't really square that off with the activism that they feel. That's something you could talk about.
Yes, thank you. And I think there is something in that, and that we know lots of young people do want to get involved in social action. There's a sense that there are plenty of things going wrong in our society, and young people want to get involved in different ways in changing that. Some people are able to do that through churches and other faith groups, and they recognise that churches can be a platform for doing so. But increasingly, as you intimated, young people are finding other ways to do that. And I think in part that's because, as I indicated before, so many young people simply have no particular reference point when it comes to religion anymore. So when they're looking to do social action, many of them wouldn't even think to, I'll do it through a church organisation or another faith group organisation, because they may have no sort of background in that space, no emotional connection. And that can mean that whilst all social action is extremely positive and is something we need to be encouraging, there can be a difference, I think, between the social action that people of faith pursue and those without a faith position. Because, as I suggested in the talk, those who are pursuing social action because of their faith, quite often they're doing it both for love of neighbour and for love of God. And so part of it is seeing in the person you're trying to help the face of God looking back, as we might say within Christianity, recognising that other person is also a child of God. And that religious motivation for social action is quite a different one, I think, than the other kinds of social action that might arise just from people without a faith background.
Would it be possible then that a faith group that's involved in social action, that actually could be an avenue of mission evangelicalism, to use the Christian word for it, but not necessarily to the people who are being aided, but the reaching out to people who wish to aid and giving them a matrix within which to, a belief system within which to express that need to aid. So in fact, you're attracting their desire to help and bringing them from that to the knowledge of faith. To express it.
Absolutely, and I think just to refer to something that Suleyman said, social action can be a form of worship. So it's in that sense it is missional in that it's not just going to other people and saying, look at the good we're doing, come and join our group. It's missional in terms of allowing the people involved to develop their own faith and using that as a form of worship. So I think you're exactly right in that it can be missional, not just reaching out to other people and calling them in, but boosting one's own internal faith in that sense. I don't want to hog all the questions. Maybe you should. Do you want to stand here and then other people can ask questions?
Out of the way, you guys can just sit there. It'll be a lot easier. I've only kept that there for the mic.
Oh right,
so
yes.
yeah, if you guys want to sit down, yeah, take a seat. Yeah, take that out of the way. Just relax. Sorry, is there a question?
Sorry, so it's a question to both speakers actually. What is spirituality and what is considered a spiritual person?
Thank you. I think that's a very difficult question, a wonderful question. Oh no, that's fine. And it's I suppose it's difficult for me because I'm personally religious, but I'm also a sociologist. And the sociologist in me would want to say, I can't define spirituality. It's something. It will mean something that's too unique to different people. People put different have different understandings of what they mean by spiritual. For me, as a religious person, spirituality is about connection with God. And but there are plenty of people in the world who would describe themselves as spiritual, but they may not necessarily believe in God. They may understand spirituality as being connecting with nature, or connecting with some form of supernatural, but isn't necessarily rooted in the idea of a God. So these kinds of terms that we have, spirituality, religion, faith, actually they can mean so many different things to different people, and quite often we can be having, you can think two people are having a same conversation about spirituality, but they might have completely different starting points about what that means.
What about the Christian faith?
Well, for Christianity, spirituality is the pursuit of God. It's trying to connect with God, and it's pursuing the spiritual life is trying to, I suppose, increase your God consciousness throughout, which is a similar kind of concept within Islam, of course. Trying to increase your awareness and understanding and feeling of God in your daily life. And some people will talk about spiritual growth, so growing in a way that you are increasingly feeling God in everything that you are doing.
I think you covered most of it.
Well,
Okay. Yes. My answer will be in line with what Mr. Perfect said. But for me, from an Islamic point of view, I would say that it is that your soul is in harmony with what your body does when it's being religious. That, as I said before, very often on the outside we can use religious words, but we don't experience them. We can act very religious. As I said, I can give you £10 in the name of God, but on the inside I'm burning, it's aching, like, why am I doing this? I'm not being spiritual, even though that I'm being outwardly religious. And this comes to what the Prophet Muhammad said, like in the collection of Sahih Muslim, when he said, وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. But God looks at your hearts, your intentions, and your actions. So for me, the spiritual person is the one who, on the inside, is at least as good as he or she is on the outside, or like Umar radiallahu anhu said, that your inside is even stronger than the good you show to the outward. So spiritual for me would be then that you live up to what you are outwardly doing with your soul, seeking God's face.
Any other questions? Sorry, a question if I may for both Jim now and Mr. Perfect. I want to get both a perspective from both.
technology as it's grown from like 20 odd years since I've been a young child, sort of growing up, it's been such a bombardment, I would say, for as Chef was saying with social media, that society and everything has sort of really moved forward with so many avenues of technology, and it's become almost a necessity in life to some aspect, especially as part of career, work progression, etc. But as you mentioned, there are pitfalls that exist within most of these different avenues. So my sort of question is, without going down the avenue of entirely shutting yourself off from such avenues, social media, technology, computers, internet, etc., where would you sort of find a balance, and any advice that you would give to make sure that you try and avoid as many of these pitfalls as possible and sort of really focus on using it for good and sort of self-reminder, etc.?
Thank you. I think part of the problem now is that we have no time for silence anymore, and that's fueled by our technology-obsessed culture. We, particularly young people, or young professionals, if you're working extremely hard throughout the day, and then come to the end of the day, there's no time for silence even at the end of the day, because you'll fill it with something based in technology, whether that be on the internet or watching TV or something. So there's always an input going in. And I think for Christians in particular, that is a serious problem, that we don't have time for silence anymore, because it means that we're no longer building space in which we can even try and hear the voice of God. Last weekend I went up to, I was on a holiday up to Windermere in the Lake District, and I climbed up to the top of the mountain, and it was the most silent experience I've ever had at the top of this mountain. I couldn't hear anything at all, and I suddenly realised I haven't experienced real silence for a long, long time. I couldn't stay on the top of the mountain because it was cold and windy, but I kind of thought, this is a place I feel called to come. I think some of us have a sense that we need to be called to places of silence, because we recognise there's something holy about that. We recognise that there's a place there where we can try and encounter God. So in terms of solutions, I think a lot of young people are recognising that always being switched on in terms of technology and social media is a problem. And a lot of people are struggling about how do you pull away from that. It's in some ways trying to find a practice of discipline that works for you, where you can sort of gradually ease yourself away from that, or even practically, I'm going to allocate this period of time every day where I know this is my silent time. And you might not need to fill it with anything. It could simply be a time I'm just going to sit there. I'm just going to relax. I'm not going to read. I'm not going to listen to anything. I'm not going to put an input in. I'm going to build into my daily life that period of silence. And how people achieve that will be different for every person. But I think recognizing that that's needed is, of course, the first step.
I have nothing to add.
That's good.
I would make an observation in some ways. Islam has an advantage over present-day Christianity in that you still, as a community, observe specific times of prayer throughout every day, whereas we've become so laissez-faire in, I think, all the Christian denominations as to when and how you worship. And so we have split up. It's no longer Christendom, everyone saying Mass at the same time, or taking Eucharist, taking Holy Communion. The very fact that I'm using 3 different terms for it is an indicator of how we have split up, and therefore we ourselves have not got that way of embracing people into a communal silence moment with God, which reinforces the individual discipline to do that. So hang on to the advantage you've got, I'm saying.
Yes. On the other hand, I also think that, as we were talking earlier, that sometimes an abundance of something may turn into a routine,
Yes,
and the point is not the quantity of something; it's the quality.
it is, but you're not going to have quality of doing it if you're not doing it.
That's okay. Checkmate. That's a good one. Yes. But I like what I read lately in the book of Timothy Keller, actually, who was actually talking about this. And he said that one should plan one's life around these silent moments, maybe not in but he said that studying the Bible, for example, and getting a good explanation of the Bible, and creating life around prayer, and the words one says during prayer, and so forth, could help one to connect to God while praying. But I don't know. I still think that an abundance of something can be also routine. And as you said, if it's not there, it can't turn into a routine. So then I think we are back to you, where you can give the solutions to this, I'm not going to say problem, but this issue. So how are we going to do this?
Sorry, rephrase it for me.
I'm actually asking the same question. Yeah. So it is. What was the question exactly?
How can we build in regular discipline within Christianity?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
It is extraordinarily difficult. I'm trying to do this myself at the moment and get into a regular pattern of prayer every day, as I'm sure a lot of young Christians are, and it is extraordinarily difficult because we don't, as you said, we don't have that inbuilt corporate sense of prayer in which it is inbuilt from the start and introduced as a community. I think there may be different ways in which people can do this. Part of it may be starting by planning out regular retreat days throughout a year, if that's something that Christians are particularly interested in. I like retreat days. Scheduling those in so that I know, okay, I might have a month of craziness, but I know that on this day it's booked in. I'm going to go away and I will spend the entire day, and it will be a day in prayer. It will be a day in silence. That can be a very practical starting point for somebody, for a Christian trying to regain some of that kind of discipline. And then the hope is that by starting small in those ways, you start to sort of build in a kind of more regularity in terms of prayer. Other practical things that people try and do, always finding the same kind of time during a day to start your prayer, so you build it into your daily habit. But I particularly like this, what Suleyman has said, sort of recalibrating our lives so that our lives are around prayer, and that we're fitting in everything else around the prayer, which is the central part. Now, I'm certainly not doing this, but I think that's a really important way to start envisioning it, that the prayer must be the central thing, and I fit other things around it. There's not. It's very difficult to offer sort of
No.
further.
But it's also, I mean, saying that here was an illustration. I understood not a word, but you had learnt it, you had studied it, and how old are you? 9. Starting young. And I'm speaking as a point of view of, I was brought up to have a daily quiet time, have the script union notes for my age group, blah, blah, blah. I didn't manage to do that with my own children. So are we actually passing on good practice at a young age so that people can actually grow up with the habits? Okay, maybe they lose them later, but have we done what we can to really give our children the means to make their own faith journey?
I think that's it. I think it's the problem so many parents and grandparents have had over the last couple of decades in this country, a real struggle to transmit regularity in spiritual practice to their children. And there's so many reasons why. Part of it is because faith is increasingly, as a sort of intimated in the talk, something that we feel comfortable, we can talk about to a certain extent. But I think for people of a different generation, faith was very private, and even though you might want to raise your children within that faith, talking within the Christian community, talking about it regularly and trying to instill those daily practices, actually there were a lot of mental barriers to doing so. I think about my own upbringing, for example. I was brought up within an Anglican family. My parents and I went to church every Sunday, but we didn't talk about God on the other 6 days. So I was exposed to faith on one day of the week, but there was no kind of there was nothing else to sort of make it a bigger part of me. And that's not, that I'm not saying that's a problem with my parents, but clearly it was something about, they felt uncomfortable talking about this. They felt there were too many obstacles, and of course they didn't want to necessarily impose it upon me as well. So there are all these kinds of barriers that we are going to have to get over if we want to try and find a way to raise the next generation within Christianity, with that sense that it is normal to talk about faith within your family. It is normal to engage in daily prayer and to encourage your children to do so.
No other questions? I'd just like to thank you all very much for coming today. It's been wonderful. The discussion has been great. I hope that we can continue this relationship together. I hope perhaps when we do form the Spelthorne and Runnymede Faith Forum, that this occurrence, this event, this type of thing happens more often, and perhaps at different venues, perhaps at the church, in and around Spelthorne and Runnymede. And I hope that you can all support us in that. I just want to end with a thank you to both our speakers. A little round of applause would be in order. Thank you very much. So the time is now 7:15. We have the evening prayer, 7:30 sharp. So what you'll find is a lot of our congregation will start sleeping through the door. We have dinner for you. So what I'd like you to do, if that's okay, is to grab the seat that you're on, literally, and go through to the back. My sons and my wife have laid out the tables there for you. You are free to actually stay here in the back. If you've not observed the Muslim prayer before, and it's a loud prayer, so the afternoon and the mid-afternoon prayer is a silent one. This one, the evening one, is a loud prayer, so you can actually hear the recitation of the Quran by the Imam who's here. So it'll be an experience. If you've not had it before, you by all means, please feel free to put the chairs just to the back of the side there and observe. You're free to do that. But I don't be, stopping you from having your dinner. Some food at the back there. Thank you very much for coming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be with you all. Thank you.